Hey everybody, good morning. Welcome to Life Science Live. Sorry for the delay. Our Wi-Fi cut out and I could not get it started. So here we are. We are talking about erosion today. We are talking about erosion. So really quick, well, we'll give people just a couple seconds to tune in. For those who are tuning in for the first time, this is Life Science Live. We do this every Friday at 11. And so if there's ever a topic that you'd like to talk about, you can feel free to comment below, and I'd love to research that and come prepared to answer your questions. So again, today we are talking about erosion, and we're going to have to draw a few diagrams. Let me make sure that I turn that around so that the words are facing the right way. Let's see. Perfect. Okay. So again, with that quick definition to start, this is going to be anything that is degrading or taking away soil either by wind or air, water, or another natural process. So basically what's happening is over time, as water is rushing by or as wind is moving by, it's moving particles of soil. That soil is not staying in one place. And so for this reason, even in geology, sometimes we see the way that rocks degrade and they may have waves in them or certain features, and it's because they've been degraded over time through erosion. And so some of these other erosive materials that could be changing the way the environment looks. For example, ice is one. What happens is glaciers use erosion and deposition to move sediment around through an area. So what happens is, it's a large glacier. Glaciers walk and they move so slow. So a large glacier is moving through time, and as it's moving, it's dragging across on the floor, on the bottom, and is dragging sediment with it and moving it into new places. And so that's part of the reason why there's a zillion glacier lakes all around the United States, because at one time there was a glacier, it either melted or pulled, and it pulled that soil out to make these lakes. So these are some of those other processes. If something is more chemical or acidic, that would be corrosive. So not quite the same thing, but the same idea that the environment is affecting the soil and these rocks, okay? So there are a few ways to combat erosion, and this is something that's on the mind of a lot of people who are in agriculture. So, okay, how can I save my soil? Because I want to maintain the nutrient-rich soil that I've accumulated over time, and also we don't want our plants sliding off a mountainside or anything like that. So there's a few things that you can do, one of which would be to have a plot that has a lot of smaller bushes and little shrubs, because what happens is in the soil, this is all of our soil, those tiny little roots come into the soil and they spread out, and those little roots kind of act as little hands and they grip onto that soil and they hold on. And so plants with little shallow roots or even larger ones are going to hold on to that soil, so when it rains or when there's a lot of wind, they're a little bit more locked into their space because these plants are holding them into their spot. So that's one thing that you could do, is you could have these tiny plants around just to hold in that soil and kind of combat erosion. This is part of the reason why riverbeds, they need a lot of plants, otherwise the edge of the bank will just sink off. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Another thing that you could do is terrace gardening. And so you've probably seen this before. I do not think I'll be able to draw it very well, but if you were gardening or on a hillside, you could have a plot of land here, a plot of land here, and here, and so your plants are growing on each of these. And the reason why they're doing that is because they're trying to combat the way that the water runs off. They're trying to combat runoff. So anytime that there is rain or you water your plants, you'd water from the top, and that excess water would just trickle down. So even when that soil is moving, it's moving onto another plot of land and still being used. So this is one way to think, okay, I can be smarter about the way that my soil is going to erode and take care of it a little bit better. So that's one way to do it. Another thing that you could do, and this is just more of like tech, is they have these erosion control blankets. And so kind of how that works is you would have your plant, and then your plants kind of grow through these blankets. You can plant seeds directly on top, and they're able to pass through the blanket, the material, and they kind of sit down and just kind of bury the plants into that location, so that again, as the wind picks up or water, they're a little bit more secure, but plants are able to pop through this blanket, so that's one other thing. But the biggest thing in terms of like just watching out is being creative about the way that we use our excess water. Where is our water flowing? Where is it going? Can we use other ways to water in order to decrease erosion? Another one of those ones that is really popular, especially for people who live in the south or you have a big farm. You see this sometimes, which is drip irrigation, which is basically instead of having a big sprinkler like you might see in southern Utah like this, which is on a pivot and runs around, there's a lot of waste with that because the wind is just going to push that around. It's a lot of water to cover a huge part of land, and so that's just coming down like this. A drip irrigation kind of looks like this, and you have your plants underneath, and it just comes down like this in a much more gentle, controlled stream. Ooh, that's really hard to see. So it kind of just drips down. And so sometimes people put them in their backyard gardens using like PVC pipe, and it's literally kind of like a leaky faucet is just kind of going on top of your plants. So that's another strategy to combat erosion, is just being more effective with the way that we use our water so that we're not destroying the soil that we've created. So we're going to talk about two quick stories. Or one quick story and one case study really fast. We want to talk about how Yellowstone was affected by erosion. Those of you who've been to the museum, you know what I'm talking about. We have our exhibit upstairs called How the Wolves Changed the Rivers. It's not here right now because it was in the kiosk and we kind of took out the touchscreen stuff with COVID-19. But if you've been here before, then you know what I'm talking about. With the reintroduction of the wolves into Yellowstone, and the wolves being a keystone species, there was a lot of changes, and one of those was that they said that the rivers changed course. What really happened was because the rivers were lacking a lot of vegetation due to other animals not being there, which were greatly affected by the wolves, the rivers kind of started to look like this. They were really wonky, they had really meandered a lot, and the reason why was because the edges and ledges of the edge of the river had completely collapsed. There was no vegetation there was no substance holding down that river, and so they were meandering. The rivers were getting very wide, much more shallow, because again the edge of that river was just eroding away. Those plants were not there. So the introduction of the wolf brought back a lot of vegetation that was previously gone and really increased the plant biodiversity in Yellowstone, which in turn changed the shape of the rivers because those banks began to be more firm and they stopped moving out. And in some cases, they were kind of built back in, and so that changed the course of the river. They were not these meandering rivers that we were losing at the time. So thinking about that, thinking with the skills that we have, that we're being aware of wind, we're being very aware of water, and other things that can erode, let's think about the Provo Canyon wildfire. We talked about it last week. We're going to talk about it a little bit again. This is why I wanted to talk about this topic, was because this is the first thing that came into my mind when we were talking last week. So you have a big mountainside, okay? Let's look at it. This is Provo Canyon. Okay, yes, that is it. That is the canyon, okay? So we've just had a wildfire, so we've kind of taken out a bunch of that vegetation. Like I said, not every spot in this wildfire was a burnout spot where it was completely down to the ground, but there are going to be places that are like that. You can picture, in a little bit more of an extreme sense, if this was a total burnout in a canyon, what would happen? So we've lost that vegetation. Because it's a canyon, we also know that the wind rips through the canyon really hard sometimes. It gets really windy in there, so we know that soil is extremely exposed to wind. We also know that it is probably going to snow this weekend, so it's also going to be affected by water, let alone rain, but also snow melt is a big thing here in Utah when we talk about erosion. We should have talked about that at the beginning. But snow melt, not even just water, but snow moving down the mountain, that is going to erode and change the landscape as well, and move around rocks and move around, transfer soil, okay? So thinking about this, if there is a big wildfire in the canyon, what is going to happen to that soil? What is going to happen? We see this a lot in Southern California where I'm from. When there's a big wildfire season, we come into the spring and we have a big, I'm gonna pause, let you think about it. We have a big what? We have a big mudslide season. That is what happens because that soil is no longer rooted into whatever landscape that it was. It's had increased wind exposure because some of those other trees might have also been burned down, and we're coming off of snow melt, and then we have our increased water from our April showers, and we get mudslides. And so these are some of the ways that erosion can affect the environment as well. It can change the course of rivers, it can cause other natural disasters. We can have an avalanche or a mudslide, more likely a mudslide though. And it is also going to change the way that animals are in the landscape. It changes the way that we interact with the landscape. It's a lot more than just a geological process. When you think about it from an environmental perspective, you can really see the environment change before your eyes. So those were just some things I wanted to talk about and share with everybody. Thinking about that, we'll have to see what happens to our area that was recently burned by the Provo wildfire. We'll have to see how it erodes. No one's really allowed up there, but we will watch from afar, we will listen, see how it erodes, and see how the environment is going to react to this increased, not availability, but access to these things. It's a little bit weaker. It's not as strong. So again, if anybody has any questions about this, feel free to drop them down below in the comments. Vulnerability, increased vulnerability of this soil, I just remembered. And if anybody has anything they'd like to learn about next week, please drop it also down below, and I would love to talk about it with you. Again, thanks for tuning in for Life Science Live. I'll see you guys later.